Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Metropolitan Republican Club's webinar series. My name is Krisha Lenzo, and on behalf of the Met Club Board, we are so happy that you're joining us tonight. We hope you'll consider making a contribution to help support the club so that we can continue to bring you content just like this. So tonight, it is an honor to have Matt Palumbo here. Matt is the editor of the Bongino Report. He is also the author of Dumb and Dumber, How Cuomo and de Blasio Ruined New York, which unfortunately we all know too well here in New York City. He also wrote Debunk This, Shattering Liberal Lies, and Spygate. Not to mention Matt's work has been published in the National Review, The American Thinker, Real Clear Markets, among many others. And just to give you a little bit of a synopsis of his book, talking about New York. So in America's early days, most immigrants entered America through New York City, mine included. For many, New York was synonymous with America and the American dream itself, a beacon of hope for the rest of the world. And now, for the first time ever, people are leaving. They're fleeing New York by the millions. Plagued with high taxes, big government, excessive regulation, as we all know, and other obstacles to liberty, there are a few reasons for, no one wants to remain in the state under Governor Andrew Cuomo's leadership and de Blasio's. And in New York City, which houses nearly half of the state's population, Mayor Bill de Blasio has been doing everything in his power to accelerate the decline and bring the city back to pre-Rudy Giuliani days. So with that, Matt Palumbo, thank you so much for joining us tonight, and looking forward to discussing all things New York and, unfortunately, the failed leadership that we're experiencing here.
Yeah, thank you for having me on. Full disclosure, I'm a New Jersey resident, not New York, but I think, one of the, also a state I think people should be fleeing from. One of the things about the book is it really is a metaphor for what's going wrong in blue states nationwide, and that, a lot of, the things, the problems I point out with Cuomo are also true in states like California and Illinois, and even states like mine in New Jersey, for all the same reasons, and they're all pretty much, people there are fleeing to all the same states, primarily Florida and Texas. So, this book is very specific to New York, and it was actually a lot of fun to write. It's a lot of fun to dunk on de Blasio and Cuomo, but also, all the lessons of this book really apply nationally.
Definitely. And that's where we'll start. We're, some might say we're coming out of the time of COVID. Some might say we're still in it, depending on your point of view, depending on the research you're looking at. I think we're coming out of it, at least from my point of view. But many don't think so, including Governor Cuomo and Bill de Blasio. But first, let's start with Governor Cuomo and his failed leadership during this time. Can you talk about his many missteps? I know you know them start to finish, but can you give us some of the key examples of where he just led us astray?
Yeah, so, the coronavirus was the main motivating factor for me writing the book or starting it. And it was primarily just the media narrative around it. It seemed that they sort of appointed Cuomo king, really from day one of the pandemic, him and Fauci, and then, Trump, they made the villain. And every media report was filtered through that narrative. Yet, you can look at really any time during the pandemic, whether it's, the first month of it or now, and New York is number 2 in deaths per capita. In fact, if New York were its own country, it would have more coronavirus deaths than any other country. So clearly he's not doing something right if that's the case. And, there was this narrative that Trump didn't take it seriously at all, when in fact he was banning travel from other countries at a time when even Fauci was advising against it, who was, supposedly also the gold standard. And, the one thing we know a year on is the countries that restricted their borders had the lowest deaths. Vietnam locked down very prematurely and allowed no entry in and out of the country. And they've had less than 100 COVID deaths in the past year. New Zealand is another example of a country that defeated COVID. And, I do think some of their lockdowns did go too far, but they also had no migration or immigration or travel in and out, rather, and that also makes it impossible for the virus to get into the country. So that really was the most effective thing that could have been done, and Trump did that. Now, the dumbest thing you would do is, we've always known about the virus. It kills elderly people disproportionately. Young people like you and I don't really have much of a risk of this at all. And so you'd think, okay, well, common sense suggests, if we're going to hinder anyone's lives or obstruct their lives in any way with lockdowns, you'd want to target it towards the elderly. Places like Sweden did that and actually never had any lockdowns. Mask wearing was voluntary, and they actually ended up having less COVID deaths than America, though they did have more than other European countries. But so protecting the elderly is very important. Now, one of the things Cuomo did, and this is probably his most infamous policy, was on March 25th, he signed a nursing home order, and that basically required all nursing homes in the state to accept coronavirus patients. Now, why would you want to do that? His logic was, or illogic rather, was there's going to be a spike in hospital usage. We're going to run out of space, so we need to free up room. So if you were a coronavirus patient and theoretically these were supposed to be people who had it for long enough where they hopefully weren't contagious, but would be sent to these nursing homes. And we know what happened next. I think it was like about 10% of all nursing homes, or around 10% of all people in nursing homes ended up dying in the months following that policy. You can look at places like Florida that never had such a policy, and it was less than 1%, I believe. The point is there's a massive magnitude of difference between those two states. Furthermore, there was one county where I think it had a Republican mayor who said quite rightly, this is a dumb policy, and we're not going to enforce it. And their nursing homes had 0 deaths over that time period. And so Cuomo has all these various different excuses for it, and they're all contradictory. So he's claimed, well, actually, there was never a nursing home policy because we never needed space because we had that ship Trump sent, and we had all the makeshift hospitals. And the fact of the matter is they were never used, so there was actually just never a demand for space. That's really what happened. But I mean, it's a bizarre defense because it's all we have to do is go to the New York State website to say, okay, it's been there. I mean, we know exactly why you did this. So it's a bizarre defense. And then he's just, we know for a fact, too, they try to cover up the amount of nursing home deaths, and they torture the statistics a lot, where if you contracted COVID in a nursing home, were transported to a hospital and died, they deliberately did not count those as nursing home deaths. Now, why would you do that unless you're trying to cover something up? There is no reason. And I guess my last point on this is, Cuomo also has tried to blame the CDC by saying, well, I was just following the CDC's guidance in allowing nursing home patients allowing COVID patients into nursing homes. And, A, that contradicts the argument there was no nursing home policy or need. B, it was primarily blue state governors who enacted nursing home policies. So you think they're obeying a Republican CDC. And lastly, he was not compliant with the CDC's policy, which stated that if you are a nursing home and you're taking COVID patients, they must be tested before entering the nursing home to see if they're still have it. And there was one state in the entire union that did not require testing. That was New York. So he had A, a dumb policy, B, a policy that was not needed, and C, and enacted it in the worst way possible.
Right. And it's hard to fathom because the decision, as you alluded to, is clearly based on politics and going against the Trump administration. But now there is finally somewhat of an investigation happening. Can you talk about the investigation, and is there any chance that Cuomo will be implicated for all of his wrongdoing here?
My take on it is I think if there are any consequences, it'll be sort of like the cover up is the crime as opposed to the nursing home policy itself. It'll be that, and there was one of his aides, I think it was Melissa DeRosa, was quoted a few months ago as basically admitting that they were covering nursing homes deaths and apologized to other state representatives. Like, we're sorry if this hurts you politically. And she also was afraid, one of the motivating factors for covering up the deaths is they were afraid of a DOJ investigation under Trump into the policy. And, some legal experts have said, well, that itself is obstruction of justice, even if it's preemptive. I can't comment on that, but I think the best bet would be that. But I'm also cynical in that, A, he's a Democrat, so, what are the odds they hold him accountable? We saw, for instance, with all the sexual harassment allegations, I think there's about 11 now, there was this wave where there's a week where it seemed like every other mother that was a politician in New York asked for him to resign. And then there was one, I can't remember the guy's name, but a week later, he was photographed with Cuomo. And I'm going, okay, so it's all for show, because you were just calling for this guy to resign in disgrace, and a week later, you're pals with the guy. So some of it I fear is performative. At least in the sexual harassment regard. And I wonder if it's going to be the same with nursing homes where, they have an investigation to be able to say they did, and they're holding their side accountable, but then nothing really comes of it.
No, since you did mention the sexual assault allegations, there are other allegations too that Cuomo internally, his office, he's considered a bully and just genuinely, the tough guy. Can you talk about some of that, the people within his office and how they might feel, demoralized?
The unfortunate thing is all these allegations came out after the book. So I don't have as much insight into that. All I know is I know 4 of them I think are going to be deposed so far. So, if I don't think there's going to be consequences like him getting impeached, but I think, maybe that testimony, hopefully it's public, people can see it, and hopefully that itself has an impact. But it's I hate to be cynical about this, but it's just, it's a blue state. Everyone in, every politician there is a Democrat and is aligned with them. And, even when they're not publicly claiming as much. So it's just hard to be optimistic he's going to be held to account. I think the only way to really do that is have the voters do that. Which, hopefully there's something there.
So shifting to another king in our city, Mayor Bill de Blasio, who sits in his, I don't even know where he sits now, maybe in Brooklyn, maybe in Gracie Mansion, who knows, maybe nowhere. But what about his policies, especially the defund the police one, which he ran with as at the first sight of any sort of, BLM support? Can you talk about where he failed us during the time of coronavirus?
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of the it's amusing because, as I mentioned, there was that narrative that Trump was the one not taking it seriously. But if you go back, like Pelosi was the one going to Chinatown in San Francisco, saying, don't be afraid, go live your life. And de Blasio was doing the exact same thing, as was his health department, and he was among those saying, go about your life, don't act like nothing anything's happening, see a movie, see a show. And the thing is, while we're obviously against lockdowns that prohibit people from having their businesses and functioning, when you do have a contagious virus, the one thing you do want to do is prohibit large gatherings. So, that's sort of one of the least controversial lockdown type measures. And that was, one of the places he fumbled. And, when he did, there are things where he was right for the, like, for instance, he was very much against locking down schools, which we know in hindsight is a bad policy. But then he locked it down, but not because of COVID, but because teachers' unions pressured him. So it's like he came to the wrong, had the right conclusion and then came to the wrong one for the opposite reason. It's just a very, weird situation to be in. And in fact, New York City actually had more coronavirus deaths per capita in the state as a whole. So as I mentioned, as bad as it was under Cuomo, it was actually slightly worse under de Blasio. And then too, he had among the strictest lockdowns. My various studies in the book showing that, probably 1/3 to 40% of the small businesses won't recover. And that reality is sort of obscured by the fact that you're seeing a great displacement, and that I even see this in my own neighborhood. Like, you have like a very small town, like immigrant-owned laundromat or fast food place or whatever. It goes out of business from the pandemic, and then a national chain comes in. That's sort of, like a soulless corporate entities replacing what was previously a small business. And I think we're going to see this sort of play out there and elsewhere. As for law and order, a great theme of the last chapter of the book is the decline, re-implementation, and then decline again of law and order in New York City. So pre-Giuliani, it was, more or less a hellscape. You had open air prostitution, gambling, drinking, vandalism, just all these sorts of open air degeneracy that contribute to crime as a whole. And part of Giuliani's philosophy was that, if you really can't fight bigger crime without fighting that kind of crime, because you are in one part sending a message that this is allowed, so one and other stuff. And B, just good people are going to avoid those places or are not going to walk the streets during the day. As well as night, and you're going to just create kind of a petri dish for lawlessness. So Giuliani targeted a lot of those low-level crimes, in addition to having an explosion of the police force on the street, and there was an unprecedented decline in crime under Giuliani, even relative to the national trend at that time. So in the last chapter, I chronicle, and actually to Bloomberg's credit, as much as he kind of sucks, he did continue the Giuliani policies. But de Blasio is just kind of obscuring those entirely. And it's just, every little thing, like there's been a huge rise in graffiti, and he's defunding the graffiti budget. They're taking more actions to be less, tough on prostitution. And in fact, there was COVID relief funds for prostitutes, if you can believe it. And then we saw, the police are demoralized. And I actually have a bullet section in the book where I'm just going to bullet from day one of him taking office all the altercations that he's had with police. And that was before the defund movement. But even that has an effect. If you're a cop, it is inevitable that there are going to be situations you're in where you have to make a very tough split-second decision, and one that the optics of which might not be good publicly, where the public is not going to fully understand what was going on and why you had to make that decision. And if the mayor is going to bow to the mob, you're you're probably going to lose your job, and B, your life could reasonably be ruined depending on how much the media runs with it. And then on top of all that, it cut $1 billion from the police department. And what we saw was there was a doubling in the murder rate last year. And shootings, again, are on the rise this year, and the trend is not slowing down or anything.
The trend is not good. And this, considering we did defund the police and went against the department more generally, it's shocking that we're still, our funds across the state, the spending is out of control, the budget's out of control, and driving businesses away, driving small businesses out of business. Can you talk about the economy in New York and how both of these leaders have failed us, and our taxes are out of whack? Why stay here?
Well, that's a comparison I do in the book, because I point out that Florida is the #1 destination for those leaving New York. So I just said, well, why not compare New York and Florida? And, the reader can decide for themselves where they'd rather live. And I think it's a slam dunk case for Florida, and that, in New York, you're paying, or government spending per person is about double in New York as it is in Florida. And, if we lived in a perfect world where government functioned as it should, you should be getting twice as many services. But obviously you're not. So on every metric, from infrastructure to education, generally Florida is either outperforming or it's pretty much the same. So, if it's the same, why pay twice as much? As for the pandemic unemployment, generally speaking, nationwide, red states or states with Republican governors have had the slowest drawdowns in unemployment, in that, I think their unemployment rates fell 2.5% on average, they spiked 2.5% on average during the pandemic, where in blue states it was a 6% spike or percentage point spike. That's more than double as bad in blue states as red states, and there really isn't that much significantly different in COVID death rates from lockdown states and non-lockdown states. So you're not you are hurting the economy more than you're hurting the virus, and you see this too in the recovery. I wrote about this recently of the 20 states that have recovered the most from the pandemic. From if you look at their trough, how many jobs they lost and how many they recovered since then, 19 of the top 20 voted for Trump. So it's it's a pretty obvious correlation there. And in fact, in October, and this is when it peaked, there was, in blue states, the unemployment rate was 60% higher than in red states. It's narrowed since then as everything reopens, but it's pretty much just goes to show that those policies did have an effect, and it didn't have an effect on the virus. It was all on the economy.
Yeah. And talking more about the economy, why is it that New Yorkers are being taxed at the highest tax bracket, yet we're not seeing the results?
Well, one, bureaucracy sort of breeds more bureaucracy. It's sort of I can't remember what the law is, that if you're at work and it takes you 30 minutes to do an assignment, and then someone gives you an hour to do it, somehow it'll start taking you an hour because I think it's called Parkinson's law, but it sort of applies to bureaucracy, in that it just sort of, the bigger it gets, the more it sort of subdivides and multiplies. And then B, it could also, in New Jersey, there's a big problem with corruption. And in fact, I had my roommate worked for the Jersey City mayor, and maybe I shouldn't. No, I'll just say it. Why not? He had access to payroll information, and there was countless examples of people double dipping, making six figures when clearly they shouldn't have, and all these little things. And I'd assume there's a similar situation in New York. Unfortunately.
Yeah. Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
And talking a little more about the future of New York, though. Where do you see us headed if we stay with these leaders? And is there any hope to turn it around? I mean, we've had numerous candidates talk to us, for governor, for mayor. What do you see the future, being for the city that right now it seems like is still pretty bleak?
Yeah, well, one of the comments I got a lot is it's not de Blasio and Cuomo that ruin New York, it's the voters of New York. And I think there's some truth to that. I actually didn't know this until recently. I think Tucker covered it, that Vermont was a red state. And obviously now it's the most blue in the nation, but it was migration from New York that turned it blue. So that's the thing. These people, when they leave the state, it's not because they're going to make another state better. In fact, we're seeing in Texas, the ratio of Republicans and Democrats is shrinking. Fortunately, in Florida, the opposite's happening. So I guess Republicans are more likely to flee to Florida as opposed to Texas. But it is, a big downside in that, they are turning other states blue, and it's not like the people remaining are really doing anything to turn it red. I know there is a movement, and I don't think this will ever happen, to split up New York, where you'd have New York City be New York, and then I think New York upstate would be like greater New Amsterdam or something. That's really the only, like, nationally, that's the only way I can really think to solve the urban-rural divide, is to say, like, why don't we take the urban centers in these states, make them their own states, and the rural areas can be their own states, and because it's we see this in presidential elections. You can all see the rural areas vote Republican, the urban vote blue, and even within those states, it's the rural voting Republican and the urban voting blue. So, my idea, if I was in charge, and I don't think this will ever happen in a million years, would just be, split up the states into urban and rural, and then, we have different competing interests, but I think it would make more sense that way.
So when doing your research for the book, can you talk about the most horrific fact that you found? And I'm sure there are many, but something that really maybe surprised you when going about, what De Blasio and Cuomo done to the city.
I mean, I think with the nursing home one, just the fact that they were the one state that didn't require people to test patients going in. And then, Cuomo himself later tried to blame nursing home staff for infecting patients. So I started contacting people who worked at nursing homes, and they all told me, no, we're tested literally every single day on the way in, so that's impossible. It's just the sort of blame game where he's tried to blame every single other person, and what is transparently the most obvious cover-up and easily avoidable policy you could imagine.
So talking about the Bongino report, we are all fans of Dan Bongino and all the great work you are doing with him. Can you talk about the site and what goes into editing and your column and all things Dan Bongino?
Yeah, so I've got 2 jobs with Dan. There's Bongino.com, which is Dan's, it's where his podcast is, and we have maybe like a half dozen or so news articles that are originally written by me and some other writers. So I do like 2 articles a day there, and I usually just take like 2 of the top stories off Bongino Report and give my take on them. Then I manage a team of other writers to help out there. So that's usually my afternoon. My morning is all Bongino Report and just, getting a fresh face on the site. And we usually have 80 to 90 or so news stories every day. So I have some helpers with that. And we have a Google Doc we work out of where we just put everything we think will work. And I go through it and, see what's good. It's not really rocket science. I just kind of, go through articles and see what do I think is best, knowing our audience. And, you having access to Dan's social media, I just kind of know what, the profile of a Bongino Report, a Bongino.com reader is. And it's crazy the level of analytics. Like, I can know, like, the average age, if they like dogs or cats, the religion, the income. Like, it's crazy the level of analytics. And I can just kind of tailor stories that I think will fit best with that demographic. So that's, pretty much my entire day is monitoring that and just, seeing what's breaking throughout the day.
And what about Dan more generally? What is it like?
I don't know how he has time to to live life at all.
Yeah.
So he's doing, just to recap, he has the podcast every morning, which has been an hour. Then at noon, he has the show that's 3 hours long. That was in Limbo's old spot. Weekend, or I guess, throughout the day, he's on Fox News as a contributor. Then on the weekend, he's has his own show on Saturdays. So I don't know where the time is for anything really, how he does it. But I don't know. He's keeping at it, and I've known him I think for 6 or 7 years now, and it's just crazy to see how things have progressed since then.
And what's it like working with him, just in general?
Well, he's very I guess he trusts my competence. He's very hands off. It's very, I mean, he'll send me a story every couple of days of I think this would be good for the site, but for the most part, it's just here you are. You can hire this many people for this many hours a week and go do your thing. And it's, nice being kind of autonomous, at work.
Well, there's certainly a reason why he trusts you, Matt Palumbo. You are someone who, I don't think you give yourself enough credit. You're like, oh yeah, it's just a Google Doc that I'm running. No, you're running a huge news site that is breaking stories every day, super important stories. Without you, without Dan's voice, I think a lot of this would not be, covered at all. So we thank you for that and for sharing all of these great insights tonight. Can you tell us all the different social handles and where we can find you and how we can support you in your work?
Yeah, on Twitter, I'm Matt Palumbo 12. On Parler, I'm forgetting my name, but I'm sure if you search, it'll come up.
We'll find you.
I'm mainly on Twitter. I don't know. I don't really get any engagement on Parler, unfortunately. But yeah, Twitter's my main place. And actually, that's probably where I am 99% of the time.
Yeah. No, that sounds great.
Yeah.
Well, Matt, thank you so much. And we look forward to seeing you in New York to talk about your book and many more topics.
The next book, you mean?
Oh, yeah, the next book.
Yes, yeah.
You can't talk about yet, right?
Actually, I could walk through it really quick. If,
yeah, could you?
Yeah. Let me bring up my little document.
Your info.
Yeah. So I'm doing a book on George Soros. Dan is actually another thing I don't know how he has time for. He's starting an imprint with Post Hill Press, which is our publisher. So it's sort of like his own branded division within the publishing company. So he wanted me to do the first book. And the way he pitched it was, there's a section in his latest book called Follow the Money that's about sort of like a lot of the Ukraine impeachment stuff, but he finds some like Soros-linked players in there. So he was just like, can you, take this, redo it, and make it into something, make it into its own book? And I was like, I'll try. So I just took that chapter, made it like a 5,000 word, basically double or triple it, made it much more comprehensive. And then I just decided, like, where do I go from here? So I decided, what I want the book to be is sort of just a guide to his spheres of influence, because my logic is, statistically speaking, he's probably going to die within the next 5 years or so. And his foundation, he bequeathed with like $18 billion a few years ago. So clearly he wants, his influence to continue. So I wanted the book to be just a recap of his life and every single place his influence around the globe. And at the end, I'm doing a little directory, which Natalie Winters is actually helping with, who I know was here recently, where we're just going to have a list of every single place the guy's ever touched and what they do. And, readers can just, anytime they see an organization quoted in the media, can reference that and say, "Oh, that's Soros backed," or he's behind it, and get some insight there. So, let me just run through the table of contents so far, which is pretty incomplete.
And then this is also good because I know you're in the process of writing it, and maybe there are people who are watching right now who have details and other inside information they can send your way.
Oh yeah, I'll really take any suggestions. So the first chapter is just intro to his life, who he is, where he came from, his hedge fund background, and I have some salacious details in there as well, obviously. But interestingly, most of them are quoted from his own work. He's actually kind of transparent about his motives, which is a bit surprising. I have a chapter called The International Influence of Soros. So I rely actually a lot. There was a leaked document from his Open Society Foundations where they have like 100 European politicians that are within his sphere of influence. So I just go through all of them. I go through every judge in Europe's Court of Justice that he's touched. I go through, then I go by continent and subdivide it into countries of just every place he's touched. And the more the narratives he's fueled through there. But I don't want it to be too boring. And then I go into just sort of subdivide it by his influence in different categories. So here's Soros' influence in the university system. And I go through all universities he's funded and the directives they funded. I have one on his media influences, just every single media outlet he's ever touched. And one part I'm working on to close out the chapter is I want to find examples where, especially pertaining to him, where his organizations sort of create an echo chamber and just feed the same narratives between each other and off each other. And cases where they've made it into the mainstream, which there are many. And then what else? I have some, let's see. Oh, and then I have his role in just influence during presidential election cycles, Biden administration members, cabinet members that are linked to Soros. One big chapter that I think actually will be the most relevant is Soros's recent foray into local politics. A lot of actually pretty much almost all the defund the police crazies have received funding from him. And I just go through one by one every single person, how much funding he got, how he backed them, and then the policies they enacted and the consequences thereof. And 100% of the time they're a disaster. And there's a little bit, actually the last thing I have is there is a trove of other leaked documents about 4 years ago. So I just go through the most notable ones and what we gleaned from them and what he was trying to hide and for what reason. But that's just a sort of a surface level overview. Hopefully it's a bit more interesting than I made it sound, but I think people will like it.
Surface level. Oh my gosh. I'm so excited to read this book. I'm fascinated, and I really think more people need to come out against Soros, and you're brave because those who do often face a lot of backlash.
We'll see what happens.
You better stay safe, Matt. Stay in New Jersey. But thank you again, and we will definitely have you back.
Thank you. Yeah, I look forward to it.
Have a great night.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.